Hello and welcome to the Computer Vault podcast, where we discuss the history of computers, computing and IT, all derived from the objects in my personal collection. I'm Aidan, and today we're going back to 1987 and 1988, a 2-year window that turned out to be one of the most pivotal in the history of personal computing. We're talking about Windows 286 and the graphical interface that was supposed to replace it, Presentation Manager. By the end of this episode, you'll understand what these two pieces of software actually were, how they were built, why one of them was quietly dropped, and how the fallout shaped the industry for decades. Let's start with a bit of context. Microsoft announced Windows on November the 10th, 1983. The first version, Windows 1.0, didn't actually ship until November 1985. It was a graphical shell running on top of MS-DOS. Its most notable limitation, windows couldn't overlap each other. Everything was tiled, laid out side by side like floor tiles, with no stacking. Dialog boxes were the only things that could appear on top of other windows. In the 2 years between the announcement and the release, Microsoft sold 500,000 copies of Windows 1.0. Then came Windows 2.0, released on December the 9th, 1987. This was a significant step. Windows 2.0 introduced overlapping, resizable windows for all Windows types, not just dialogues. It added desktop icons, keyboard shortcuts, and the terms minimize and maximize that we still use today, replacing the earlier iconize and zoom. It also added support for 16-color VGA graphics. Word for Windows and Excel for Windows launched alongside it, and PageMaker, which had previously been Mac only, appeared in a Windows version. Some computing historians point to that PageMaker release as the moment when Windows became a serious platform, because it was the first significant non-Microsoft application to appear for it. Windows sales reached 1 million copies in 1988. It's also worth noting something that happened in March. Just 3 months after Windows 2.0 shipped, Apple filed a lawsuit against Microsoft, claiming that the overlapping windows and other interface features in Windows 2.03 violated copyrights Apple held on the Macintosh interface's look and feel. Apple listed 189 separate GUI elements it claimed were infringed. That lawsuit would drag on for years, ultimately ending in 1994 when the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruled in Microsoft's favour, finding that most of the claimed elements were already licensed under an early 1985 agreement between the two companies. But in 1987 and 1988, it was an open legal question, and Microsoft was operating under that uncertainty. Now, talking about Windows 286 specifically, this version 2.1 of Windows was released on May the 27th, 1988, less than 6 months after Windows 2.0. It came in two variants sold separately, Windows 286 and Windows 386. The naming reflected the Intel processor each variant was optimized for. Windows 286 was priced at $99 and Windows 386 cost $195. There's an important clarification worth making about the name. Despite being called Windows 286, it did not actually require an 80286 processor. It ran perfectly fine on an 8088 or 8086, the older chips in the original IBM PC and PCXT. What the 286 branding indicated was that the software could take advantage of the 80286 High Memory Area, or HMA, an additional 64 kilobytes of addressable memory that existed just above the 1 megabyte boundary. For machines that didn't have a 286, Windows 286 simply didn't use the HMA. It worked, but without that extra memory. Windows 286 also introduced the HIMEM.SYS HIMEM.sys driver, a piece of software that managed access to the HMA. It also supported several EMS expanded memory specification boards, which were added in cards that could bank switch memory to make more RAM available to applications. The EMS support was separate from the 286 processor functionality. You could have an 8086 machine with an EMS board and still benefit from that part of Windows 286. One small historical footnote: Windows 286 was the first version of Windows to require a hard disk drive for installation. Previous versions could be installed and run from floppy disks. That requirement to have a hard disk was a meaningful change in 1988. In terms of the graphical interface, Windows 2.1 didn't change the UI compared to Windows 2.0. The changes were under the hood, performance improvements, and that enhanced memory management. The user interface changes in 2.0, overlapping Windows icons keyboard shortcuts, those were carried over unchanged into 2.1. One documented oddity, IBM shipped Windows 286 alongside 8086 based hardware, the PS2 Model 25, as part of a DOS 4.00 and Windows kit for the educational markets. That resulted in some confusion when buyers received a box labelled Windows 286 and found they had a machine that didn't contain an 8286 at all. A minor update to Windows 2.11 followed on March 13, 1989, with small changes to memory management, AppleTalk support, and printer drivers. Microsoft ended support for Windows 2.1 on December 31st, 2001. While all of this Windows development was happening, Microsoft and IBM were working on something larger. IBM and Microsoft had signed a joint development agreement in August 1985. The project, codenamed CP-DOS, took 2 years to reach its first product. OS2 version 1.0 was announced in April 1987 and released in December of that year. It was a text mode only operating system, no graphical interface yet, but it offered genuine protected mode multitasking and sported up to 16 megabytes of RAM, addressing the fundamental limitations of DOS. At a 1987 Computer World interview, Bill Gates predicted that 3 years out, over 80% of new Office systems will be based on OS2. He also said Microsoft would release Windows applications first with what he called very cheap upgrades to OS2 versions. The expectation in 1987 was that OS2 would be the platform of the future, and Windows was a bridge to get there. Many of the changes in Windows 2.0 were made deliberately to align with the upcoming graphical interface for OS2. That interface was Presentation Manager. Presentation Manager, PM as developers called it, was the graphical user interface for OS2. It was co-developed by Microsoft and IBM's Hursley lab in England between 1987 and 1988. Its internal code name was Winthorn. It shipped with OS2 version 1.1, which was released in November 1988. OS2 1.1 is sometimes also noticed as having an October 1988 release date depending on the source. The Wikipedia article on OS2 states October 1988, while other sources say November. The important point is that it arrived in the second half of 1988. Presentation Manager was described as a cross between Microsoft Windows and IBM's mainframe graphical system GDDM, the Graphical Data Display Manager. Like Windows, PM was message-based, and many of the internal messages used by the two systems were actually identical. But there were also significant differences, and those differences turned out to matter a great deal. The most technically notable difference was in the coordinate system. In Windows, the point 00, the origin, was at the top left corner of the screen. In Presentation Manager, the origin was at the bottom left, matching the mathematical Cartesian coordinate convention. That single difference meant that porting a graphics application from Windows to PM, or vice versa, required rewriting every piece of code that calculated a position on screen. It wasn't just a cosmetic adjustment. There was also a deeper architectural difference in how drawing worked. In Windows, all drawing operations went through the device context. Presentation Manager used device context too, but added an extra layer of abstraction called the presentation space. PM's graphical engine was IBM Graphics Programming Interface, or GPI, a more capable and more complex system than Windows' own drawing layer. Some of the GPI concepts, such as viewing transforms, were later incorporated into Windows NT. The Presentation Manager specification was completed before Windows 2.0 shipped, and because PM wasn't constrained to be backwards compatible with Windows 1.0, it was a clean slate design. Its developers had room to make changes. One example, PM supported proportional fonts from the start. Windows didn't gain proportional font support until 1990. OS2 1.1, the release that introduced Presentation Manager, also bumped the minimum RAM requirement to 3 megabytes. It added support for larger disk partitions, dual boot with DOS, and named pipes, which are more important for LAN manager networking. The OS2 Museum has documented that the early presentation display drivers were written entirely in assembly language, partly for performance and partly because the code had been adapted from Windows display drivers. That complexity was one of the reasons OEMs struggled to provide good display drivers for OS2. Among the first applications available for Presentation Manager were Borland Sidekick, Microsoft Excel 2.2, and the Describe word processor. PageMaker 3.0 by Aldus was also ported. Microsoft Excel for Presentation Manager was itself a port of the Windows version, which was in turn a port of the original Macintosh version. One of the most cited reasons for what eventually became the IBM Microsoft split was the divergence between the Presentation Manager API and the Windows API. Although both systems were message-based and conceptually similar, the practical differences in coordinate systems, drawing models, and application structure made source compatibility between the two essentially impossible. You couldn't write a program once and recompile it for both platforms without substantial changes to the code. The OS2 Presentation Manager porting guide, included with the OS2 software development kit, gave developers instructions on how to move their Windows code to PM. Microsoft itself used an internal set of libraries called WLO, Windows Libraries for OS2, to develop the OS2 versions of Word and Excel. WLO was essentially a port of the Windows API to run on OS2. It's documented that this product was finished around the time of what eventually became the IBM Microsoft split, and it doesn't appear to have ever been released publicly. OS2 version 1.2 followed in October 1989, bringing enhancements to Presentation Manager, the new high-performance file system, HPFS, which supported long file names along other improvements, rec scripting, and installable file system support. While OS2 development continued, a separate project was beginning inside Microsoft. In 1988, two Microsoft engineers, David Weiss and Murray Sargent, began working independently on a new version of Windows that could run in protected mode on a 386 processor. They produced a prototype running Word, Excel, and PowerPoint in separate protected memory segments and presented it to the company executives, who approved it as an official project. When IBM learned of this project, it damaged the relationship between the two companies, but Microsoft stated it would cancel Windows after the release of this new version and continue developing OS2. That new version was Windows 3.0, released on May the 22nd, 1990 in New York City, at an event with 6,000 attendees that was broadcast live to 7 other North American cities and 12 cities internationally. Windows 3.0 achieved 4 million sales in its first year. By the time its successor, Windows 3.1, was released, total sales of Windows 3.0 had reached 10 million copies. Time magazine reported Windows 3.0 was selling at 4 million copies in the first year, a rate described at the time as then blistering. In 1990, as Windows 3.0 was selling strongly, Microsoft and IBM were reassessing how to divide future OS2 work. The agreed arrangements was that IBM would take over maintenance of OS2 1.0 and development of OS2 2.0, while Microsoft would continue work on OS2 3.0. In the end, Microsoft decided to recast what had been NT OS2 3.0 as Windows NT, a new operating system not tied to OS2's architecture, developed under David Cutler. All future OS2 development was left to IBM. The Wikipedia article on Windows 3.0 notes that Microsoft initially told IBM it would cancel Windows after 3.0's release, but then did not do so. IBM continued developing OS2 independently. OS2 2.0 was released in April 1992 as a fully 32-bit operating system. IBM had shipped over 1.7 million copies of OS2 2.0 by October 1992. OS2 2.1 followed in May 1993, and IBM released OS2 Warp version 3 in 1994. As for Presentation Manager, IBM continued developing it through all subsequent versions of OS2. In OS2 2.0, the workplace shell was introduced on top of PM, providing an object-oriented graphical environment. Presentation Manager remained a core component of OS/2 throughout its commercial life. OS/2 did not disappear when the consumer market moved on. It found a home in industrial and embedded systems, ATMs, transit control systems, and similar environments where stability mattered more than consumer software availability. The Vancouver SkyTrain automated light rail system ran on OS/2 until the late 2000s, when it was replaced by Windows XP. The London Underground Jubilee Line Extension Signals Control System ran on OS/2 from 1999 to 2011, and NPR's public radio satellite system used OS/2 from 1994 until it was retired in 2007. IBM eventually granted rights to continue OS/2 sales and development to a company called Serenity Systems International under an OEM license. Serenity's product was named Ecom Station. In February 2015, a company called Arca Noe acquired Serenity Systems, and the modernized OS/2 distribution became Arca OS. Arca OS 5.0 incorporated the JFS file system, originally from OS/2's codebase, later ported to Linux, and then ported back as a bootable file system option. On the Windows side, it's documented that some Presentation Manager concepts carried into Windows NT. Windows NT initially supported the HPFS file system, Text Mode OS/2 1.x applications, and OS/2 LAN Manager network support. Some early Windows NT materials included OS/2 copyright notices embedded in the software. GPI concepts such as viewing transforms were incorporated into Windows NT graphical subsystem. The Wikipedia article on Presentation Manager notes that IBM's Workplace Shell, the object-oriented interface that sat on top of PM in OS/2 2.0, was a precursor to Windows Explorer. There's also a lesser-known thread involving Hewlett-Packard. In the late 1980s, HP and Microsoft collaborated on an implementation of Presentation Manager for Unix systems running the X11 windowing system. The project produced two components, a toolkit and window manager called CXI, Common X Interface, and an implementation of the Presentation Manager API for Unix called PMX. Both were submitted to the Open Software Foundation as candidate user interface standards for Unix. OSF selected CXI, but chose Digital Equipment Corporation's XUI API instead of PMX. The resulting standard became Motif. Microsoft and HP continued PMX development for a period after Motif's release, but the project was eventually abandoned. So, to bring this together, Windows 286 was Windows 2.1, released May 27, 1988 at $99. It was a version of Windows that could take advantage of the Intel's 8286 high memory area, an extra 64 kilobytes, while also running older 8086 hardware without that feature. It was the first Windows version to require a hard disk. It didn't change the graphical interface introduced in Windows 2.0. It was a performance and memory management update. Running in parallel with it was Presentation Manager, a graphical interface co-developed by Microsoft and IBM's Hursley Land, codenamed Winthorne, released with OS/2 1.1 in the late 1988. PM was architecturally different from Windows in its coordinate system, its graphics model, and its application structure. Those differences made the two platforms incompatible at source code level. IBM continued developing PM throughout all OS/2 releases. Microsoft resources moved to Windows, which went on to dominate the personal computer market. Conceptual elements of PM's design survived in Windows NT. Thank you for listening to the Computer Vault podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review on whichever platform you're listening on, and be sure to come back for our next episode where I'll talk about a new topic. You can also check out my website at www.computervault.co.uk, where you'll find previous blog posts from the podcast episodes and details of my collection, which includes books, manuals, CD-ROMs, floppy disks, magazines, cassette tapes, and some old retro computers too. You can also support the podcast and the collection via the website, where you'll get a member-only access to our large digital collection and access to the postal loan service, where you can borrow books from the collection on a range of fiction and non-fiction, retro and modern topics. Until next time.